I think about words a lot. That's why I harass you about love. You can't love pizza, remember? Or sometimes I want to harass you about awesome, because we use awesome to describe new shoes. We don't have much left to talk about God. Right? We just sang that God is awesome. I bug you about words because words matter to me, and words like church matter a lot. And I find myself all the time embarrassed that my children will say, because I have said we're going to church. And I think, that was just not right. But I've said it enough that they picked up on it. And we think the church is a building. The church is a steeple. The church is a resting place, and we forget that the church is a people. Now Jesus, as I just told the children, says the word church about twice in all the Gospels. Matthew's the one who records it. Jesus talks about church once at Caesarea Philippi, and Peter's there, and he says, I'm going to build the church on you, Peter, the rock. And then a couple chapters later, chapter 18, he says how to be the church. He gives us this teaching on what the church is. And in both cases, it's very clear that Jesus is not talking about a building or a steeple or a resting place. He's talking about a people, a gathered community of people. So I want you to think about a little bit more what this means. If it was just a building, church would be pretty easy. I mean, we'd have to have the trustees, make sure we had the building in good shape and the heat on and the air on and that sort of thing. But church would be pretty easy if all it was maintaining a building. There are people who do that for a living every day of the week. Church gets tough when we go from the church being a building to the church being people. And Matthew 18 is designed, I think, to help us understand how to be the church. We rarely, in our preaching around here, read an entire chapter of the Bible. That's because we need to dig in some sections and really kind of get it. There's so much in nearly every verse that it would be hard to try to cover it all. It's going to be hard today to go an entire chapter. We need to. It's necessary today because people will zero in on a few verses in 18 and get real excited about the opportunity there to toss somebody out. And until we read the entire chapter, I think we've gotten a little askew on what it means when Jesus says this is how you deal with an unrepentant sinner. So we need the whole thing. We can't just zero in on those 5 verses where Jesus says what to do when somebody won't follow some rebuke, won't be changed. I think about these verses, those 5 in particular, and how they're really, I think, 2 ends of the spectrum that people deal with when they get to those verses. Some are on the end of, yeah, right. That this 3-step process of how to deal with somebody who has sinned is really just impossible to imagine. They could not imagine an individual coming up to me, Bobby Jean coming up to me and saying, Will, I've been discouraged by something that has gone on between you and me, or you and another, and I need to bring this before you, because I know in Matthew 18, Jesus says that a person should come to a person in the church and work this thing out. That's hard to imagine. It's nearly impossible to imagine then that if I say, I don't want to hear it from you, Bobby Jean grabs a couple others and they come back to me and say, hey, we've got a little crowd and we're going to work this thing out. And we know what won't happen then is step 3. Because at that point, things have gotten so weird or so uncomfortable or so available that I could just drive down the street to church number 2 and start my life over there. Never learning from Bobby Jean what she and the others had to help me find out about what it means to follow Jesus. So it's hard for us to imagine on one end that this could ever actually happen in our modern day of 1,000 church options and some ease with which we might depart from one another. On the other extreme, most of us would get very anxious about the idea that someone could say, I've checked off all 3 steps and now I can kick you out of my church life. There are denominations that you still banish, that still say to someone, you have sinned and this way you have not repented and you must no longer be part of our community of faith. And that too gives us great cause for concern. But when we read the entirety of chapter 18, I think I hope correctly, that that either one of those extremes is not fair to the gospel as Jesus presents. I think the way he drops these verses right in the heart of a whole lot of other verses about humility and forgiveness gives us a sense with which what he meant about how we go about helping one another be faithful followers of Jesus. It's hard to think when we turn to these verses that sin doesn't matter. And it's hard to think when we turn to these verses that forgiveness is not required. Jimmy, verse 6. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it will be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions for stumbling are bound to come, but woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into the hell of fire. Now that's not a Lord who takes sin too lightly. That's not a Lord who I think wants us to pretend as though someone else's sin or our own sin does not matter. We don't use the word sin too often anymore. We're fond of euphemisms, mistakes, situations. We've got all kinds of ways of rationalizing our sin in our lives, and we have a whole lot more ways of keeping ourselves distanced from those we think we've discerned have found themselves in places of sin. And yet I think it's faithful to read what Jesus is saying here to say, while we haven't gotten it all right, we need to care enough about one another to not want them to end up in places that are separate from God, eternal fires and such. I think we are meant to love one another enough to want for one another the fullness of life, life abundant that Jesus said He came to bring for us, and that means a deepening of relationship with Jesus and a walk with Jesus, a living out of that faith. I think Jesus wants for us to love each other that much that we would actually care what another does, how another follows. Jesus who said, righteousness, our righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus who said, be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. I think we cease to be church if we think it does not matter how each of us lives in our following of Jesus Christ. If we're indifferent to one another, then we're not church. We're just people who collect in. The church is a building. We're not people who are the church gathered in a building at that point. And yet, I think we also cease to be the church if we don't hear the rest of that chapter. The rest of this idea that we're called to be humble and we're called to forgive. You've heard verses 1 through 5 read to the children and read to us. The one who becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He who would follow me must become like a child. When I was a child, there was a little group of us in the neighborhood who were kind of tiny rat pack. And the 4 of us did everything together every day of the summer. We'd start out in the morning in the baseball field, and we'd have some basketball time. We'd crash to my house for lunch, and we'd hit the pool, and then we'd go off in the woods. I mean, every day, all day long. Well, Carrie and Patrick were the ones closest to my age, and I was always wanted to be their best friend, and it always helped if it was individually one of their best friends. So I relished the time when Carrie and Patrick get into a fist fight, which was fairly frequent. They were kind of both these passionate guys, and we'd be in the middle of baseball, and all of a sudden it would turn from baseball into boxing, and Mitchell and I would stand back and watch. A few minutes later, like 30 minutes later, I'd turn to Mitchell and say, "They're like best friends." I mean, but Carrie and Patrick would be walking off doing something by themselves. All those strong words, all those hits. And that was behind them. They were back to be the closest of friends. Children, till a certain age, don't hold grudges. Unless you become like a child. You have no place with me. I think about my own children, how they go from being each other's worst enemy to being the strongest alliance in the community the moment they switch on themselves and turn to me. Right? They become, when they realize I am the common enemy, this old man who we can get something from, they become this great pack together. Children are able to move past whatever the last minute's thing was in a way that adults sometimes have a long, hard struggle trying to do. And then there's that humility. I don't think it's possible. I do not believe it is possible for someone to actually help me, as in the Bobby Jean scenario, come to a better understanding of what it means to follow Jesus if that person doesn't come in with humility. If that person comes to me and says, I've got this right, I've got life with Jesus right, let me tell you how to get your life with Jesus right, I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time listening to that person try to get my life with Jesus right. I think in our scenario, Bobby Jean has to allow the unthinkable, which is that she may have also contributed in some way to our little conflict that was going on. At least it's possible that in some way, the person coming to say this thing, you don't believe it, do y'all? At least in some way, that both of us might have contributed to this thing. I think that part of helping another come to a better walk with Jesus is compassion. Is having a sense, or at least attempting to have a sense of what they have come through and where they are on their journey that looks a little bit or a lot different from the journey we are on when we're trying to help them along their way. And I think we have to love them. And this is why I don't think we get to just call up anybody we see doing whatever and say, hey, let me tell you where you're wrong. I really think we have to love them before this will work. We're told to speak the truth to one another in love. And until we're loving one another, all we're doing is figuring out a way to bring another down. But when we truly love them, then we're seeking for them a better life in Christ, that abundant life that Jesus came to provide for us. A life modeled on God who is our shepherd, right? Verse 10. Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father. What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. Our model is the God who leaves the 99 on the mountainside to go and find that one that is lost. There's a lot of risk involved in that. Those 99 that were on the mountainside could go astray. Those 99 on the mountainside that were safely cared for could now be attacked. That one may never be found. Or finding that one may put the shepherd in great danger. There's risk in bringing back, seeking out a brother or sister in Christ and sorting through what it means to follow Jesus together. There's risk that that person may never hear what we're trying to say or the spirit with which we mean to say it. There's risk that we will be alienated by those who kind of gang up with the one that we were hoping to bring back. And yet in our model from God, the shepherd rejoices, right?